Hi. Hey, Clarissa.
You're live, Ashley.
Okay. Are you guys hearing an echo? It's okay.
No.
Good. All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our fourth marijuana licensing work group. We really appreciate everybody being here again. We'll have to see how we get through this meeting, but I think this probably will be, the fourth of our scheduled ones. We might have to have another one later down the road. But thanks a lot for the great conversation we had 2 weeks ago. I thought that was really valuable. I really learned a lot. I also appreciated the comments that we all talked about learning from other jurisdictions and figuring out how we can create a program that's equitable, sustainable, and meaningful. So looking forward to that conversation. And then also, I don't know how many of you attended yesterday, John Bailey and BCEI hosted a great Zoom meeting that had national leaders from around the country speak, including from New Jersey, from Washington, from Oregon. Where else, John? There was a couple of other, Illinois, a couple of other jurisdictions represented, and again, had great conversations about what's working there, what their ideas are, just a lot of information to inform our work. So with that, I look forward to chatting with you guys today and having a robust conversation once again, and I'll turn it over to Molly. Are you on mute, Molly?
Okay. There we go. Is that better? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. All right. So hi, everybody. Thanks again for joining us. I think we'll go ahead and start with the same couple of slides and information that we started with the last couple of times and do a roll call as well. So let's see if I can. Let's go ahead and start with the roll call and just make sure we know who all is on the call. So obviously Ashley and myself are here. Councilwoman Black, are you there? No, not today. Okay, Councilwoman Sitabaka. Okay, Councilman Hines. All right, not yet. And Kenneth Allison, I know I've seen you. Hi, Kenneth.
I'm here. Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good.
Anshul Baga from the City Attorney's Office.
I'm here.
I'm Anshul. John Bailey. We heard you a little bit ago, John. Are you still there? All right, John, if you're there, we can't hear you, so we'll come back and check in a little bit. Sarah Belstock.
Good afternoon.
Hello. And who's next? Truman Bradley.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Truman. Diane Cooks. No. Sean Coleman. You there, Sean? All right, smaller group today. Jacqueline Fluke.
Yes, hi. Yes.
Hi. Michelle Garcia.
Hi. Hi.
Hi, Michelle. Michelle Holine.
So.
Andrew Howard. You there, Lieutenant Howard? No. Let's see, Clarissa Creek. I think I saw you. Hi, Clarissa.
Hi guys.
Henny Lastly.
Here.
Hi, Henny. Jason Moore.
Hey, everybody.
Hi, Jason. Dan Pabone.
Hey, everyone. I'm here.
Great. Hello. Jessica Scardina.
Hi, guys. I'm here.
Hi there. Ian Seed.
Hi, everybody. I'm here.
Hi, Ian. Ryan Tatum.
Hey, everyone. I'm here.
Hi, Ryan. Artway. Okay, and Sarah Woodson.
Hi, everyone.
Hey, Sarah, and I see Sean just joined. Hi, Sean. Anybody else that just joined in the last couple of minutes that wasn't here when I went through? And then if you're here, but I'm sorry, what's that?
Jason Moore.
Oh, yep, we heard from Jason. And so anybody else that is here, but maybe we weren't able to hear you or something's wrong with the audio, just maybe send something in the chat to let us know that you are here. And we'll make sure we mark you here and know that we can refer you with questions. So a couple of reminders before we get started, just the same kind of housekeeping reminders that we've talked about the last couple of times. First of all, just make sure if you're not speaking, your microphone is muted so that we can reduce feedback and echoes. As you begin to speak, just remember to kind of announce who you are, help you know who to move the camera to, and it also helps with the audience, just knowing who you are and what your background representation is. And then I think that's it for that kind of stuff. And then the chat, just try to remember to use the chat if you have a question and you don't feel like you're able to just speak up. Just go ahead and put something in the chat that says I have a question and we'll queue you up and get kind of a line going, and we'll work through that as we go. But also feel free to just kind of jump in if you have a question or a statement as well. A couple of other reminders that this is the Marijuana Licensing Work Group, which is an advisory work group. So we're here to hear your recommendations and ideas and input and perspectives on, first we talked about cannabis hospitality license. First we talked about delivery licenses, and then hospitality and sales. And then we had a great conversation 2 weeks ago about developing an equity program. So we're going to complete that conversation today with not just the lens of the new licenses of hospitality and delivery, but also the existing licenses that we already have in our existing framework. So and then we'll take that input and we will bring that into a proposal that we'll come back to you all with, but then also bring forward to the mayor and the city council as well. Okay. So with that, unless there are, oh, and then one more thing about public input, and oh, somebody says they can't understand me. Is my audio coming through weird?
Yeah, you're cutting a lot.
Okay. So let me maybe try to come back out and come back in again, okay?
Sounds good. And Sean, you're live, just so you know, just because I had to put somebody so the public would see.
Okay, is that any better?
For now,
Yes.
yes.
Okay.
I'll text you if it gets bad again.
Okay. So what I was saying, I don't know if everybody heard me, but was just reminding people that it's an advisory work group, and we're going to take all the input and advice that we hear today and through the last 3 work groups and bring that forward into a proposal to the mayor's office and eventually through city council. So we thank you for your input, and it's really valuable to us as we build a proposal moving forward. And then my one last reminder around public input and written comments is if there's anybody out there viewing through the public link, please feel free to send us an email at marijuanainfo@denvergov.org and let us know that you're here and viewing. And if you want to sign up for the bulletin or receive any additional information. And then also we have public comment templates on our website for the previous discussions as well as the discussion for today. And so that is the way to submit public comment for this work group. Okay, so I'll go ahead and jump into the presentation unless anybody has any opening thoughts or questions. All right, so I think Michelle Garcia is here, and just given the topics of the conversation and everything that we have to talk about today, she was going to open us up with a little intro. So do you want to take it away, Michelle?
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to provide some additional framing in light of the times that we're in. Be sure that everybody feels that they are able to participate. Can you guys hear me? I'm
It's
hearing
terrible audio. Yeah. Can everybody else shut their microphones, please? Try now, Michelle. Let's see.
Okay. Is that better?
I think that's a little better. Let's go for it.
All right. Yeah, so conversations of equity and race can always
Nope,
be.
it's not, Michelle.
Nope.
It's
I still hear the echo, guys.
yeah. And looks like everybody's muted.
Hey, Pia. So it's asking, I hung up my phone. Get the other people hang up phones if people have called in.
I hear the background with you too, Ashley.
Yeah.
And I heard myself echo when I spoke just to say hello. I heard my own voice echoed.
Okay, let's try now. Michelle, I muted everybody.
Okay, so I just wanted to get a little bit of an introduction. It does seem to be working, which is great.
Okay, so it's just a 303-378 number. That number I had to be muted on my side. So if you have that number, please text me. And if you can't speak and say anything. Sorry, Michelle, go ahead.
Yeah, so I just sort of wanted to say a few words about sort of having voice in a community about equity and race. And I think a lot of us want to be really sensitive to how we're saying things and the role that we have and whether or not it's appropriate to speak out on some of the issues surrounding equity and racism that we've seen experienced in our community, in our country for hundreds of years. And so the context sort of I wanted to share is that equity is going to be what the community tells us equity is, right? What a vision for equity eventually is a closing of the gaps identified as sources of inequity. And so while we are community focused and community supportive, you guys are technical experts. And so you're here to sort of help provide guidance to excise and license in how to achieve equity. And so really maybe focusing on the details of how and allowing the space for community to help inform what our goal is, but understanding that we all have a role here today and we all have expertise to share in what it might look like to sort of move those needles towards equity and away from inequity. And so I just sort of wanted to provide that on behalf of the Mayor's Office of Social Equity and Innovation. We're very excited to have everyone working together towards achieving a more equitable Denver. That was all I had.
Sorry, 1 second. Okay, sorry. It takes a really long time for my unmute to go away. So sorry about that. Okay, well, thanks, Michelle. So I'll go ahead and jump in. We have a lot to cover today. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in pretty quickly here. And the first, so I'll share my presentation, but the first slide that we're going to talk about is actually the program comparison that we talked about a little bit at the last meeting, and people had requested some additional information about. And so Abby Borchers from the Excise and Licenses Office has actually been working on this and doing some of this research. And so she's going to present the information that she was able to find. So let me share my slides and we'll pull that up and let Abby talk about it. All right. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, go ahead, Abby.
Hi, everyone. Like Molly said, my name is Abby Borchers. I'm a policy analyst with Excise and Licenses. And I just put together this slide to give a high-level comparison of the main features of equity programs in 10 different jurisdictions. The categories at the top of each column are intended to capture the main features of the program, but are not necessarily all-inclusive of every piece of the program. And if you're curious, you can click the hyperlinks in the left-hand column just to get more information about the program. So I'll just kind of walk through how to read the chart. So programs in the financial assistance column may offer waived, reduced, or deferred fees, or they may have a loan program for equity applicants. Programs in the technical assistance and education column include things like business skills training or help with understanding regulatory and application requirements. Priority application processing and scoring means that equity applicants receive expedited or priority processing of their new or renewal applications, or that they receive additional points on their applications for fulfilling certain equity criteria. The priority and exclusive access to licenses column includes programs that reserve an entire class of licenses or a portion of licenses for equity applicants, or equity applicants get early access to certain license types. And then the incubator program column just indicates that a program offers an incubator program, which would be similar to our state's accelerator program. And then the second to last column gives a high-level summary of the eligibility criteria each program uses. It's important to note that each jurisdiction has slightly different variations on the criteria, but the terms in these boxes are just intended to capture the high-level characteristics the criteria are trying to capture. And applicants may only need to meet one or a few of the criteria to qualify. And then the last column gives you a glimpse of the legal challenges and any resulting licensing delays that some of these programs have faced. The lawsuits are very nuanced, and if you're curious, I would encourage you to click on those links provided, or just do a Google search for media coverage that do a pretty good job of explaining the cases. So this chart is really meant to be a high-level guide. So feel free to do some research offline and let us know your observations in written comment, or if you've already done some research, we can talk about your observations now. And then we're also following along with all of these programs and having conversations with some of our partners in other jurisdictions just to see what we can learn from them and what challenges they've faced. So
great. So thanks, Abby. Does anybody have any questions or observations that they want to make at this point with these programs? No, I'm not hearing anything unless somebody's chiming in and I can't hear. So, all right, well, we'll go.
Can you guys post a link in the chat for this document so that the public can access it?
Sure, yeah. BR, can you go ahead and send the link to where the presentation is on the website? And put it in the chat.
Yes, I can do that. It's also on your email that you received from me on Monday, Councilwoman, but I'll send it again in the chat right now.
Thank you.
This was Jack Klug with a question.
Yeah.
Abby, in your discussions and research with these other jurisdictions, did any of them seem to think that their social equity programs were working well or successful?
The conversations we've had have been really nuanced. So I think, you know, we've spoken to partners in Los Angeles and Massachusetts, and they have acknowledged some of their successes and some of their challenges, and have had some really good advice about what kind of things to think about when we're creating an equity program. But I don't know if anyone's prepared to say that they're a success outright.
And what are some of the things that jurisdictions have identified as problems or hindrances in making it successful?
Some have identified problems with communication. That's been one we've heard a lot, is just making sure that you have really open and transparent and frequent communication with your equity applicants. There's been some operational challenges for some places in terms of just rolling it out. Some others, I could point to some specific examples, but like Massachusetts has had some trouble with their local jurisdictions cooperating with creating their own equity programs. So there's a few different challenges.
Has anybody said that there was a lack of equity applicants, or have they all found that there have been a substantial number of equity applicants?
That's a good question. I think each of these programs are in different stages of being rolled out, so it's hard to compare. But you know, programs that have been in existence for a little bit longer, like Massachusetts and Los Angeles, have seen, I would say, pretty high numbers of applicants, relatively speaking, maybe upwards of 100 applicants.
Thanks.
Truman has a question next.
I'm wondering if the city had time to look at any social equity policies outside of the cannabis space. I mean, if we're talking specifically about lawsuits, I would imagine that doesn't, you know, that's not a unique problem to cannabis.
Well, and this is Ashley. That's what's guided, you know, Jason and Jason's legal advice to us that he shared yesterday or last time. Jason Moore, our city attorney.
Yeah, this is Jason. The marijuana licensing, or any licensing, and the use of equity program is new across the country. So we don't have much to compare it to, except for other equity programs that have been around for decades. That was an issue pointed out in the Ohio lawsuit. So it's something I'm very happy to talk about with anybody. It's kind of a long conversation, but since equity in this space is new, we're all creating something. We're inventing something here and trying to make it as effective as possible.
Any other questions on this before we move forward?
Yes, Henny has a question.
Henny
has a question, sorry.
Thank you. This is Henny Lassie with Smart Colorado. I'm curious, and this may not be the appropriate place to really bring this up, but when we have the Healthy Kids Colorado data that shows that communities of color have been, that our kids that are, especially communities of color, have been impacted when it comes to youth use rates. I'm just curious if the city and industry members that are on this call have looked at or considered how all of this ties into making sure that we don't continue to pile on where there might already be potential issues around communities that are impacted, as Councilwoman Sitabaka pointed out on our first call, the outlet density that is unbelievable in her particular district. And so and again, you can push me off, Molly, if need be, but how we're coming together on making sure that this is a well-balanced issue when it comes to kids, neighborhoods, etc. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, and I'm hoping that exactly what we're able to get to today, is striking that balance of making sure that the key pieces of our regulation and the framework that we've established over the last several years, and the protections that we've been able to put in for youth and the different communities that through the CAP and other things like that, the saturated communities, that we can develop an equity program that balances those needs as well.
Yeah, I think where we're sitting, and thank you, Molly, for that explanation, is the deep concern about with the impact of the COVID crisis that happened both not only to the state, but also to the city's budget when it comes to youth prevention programs is deeply concerning. And so I just want to make sure that that's on the table as part of our concerns at SMART.
Yep, great point. Okay, so I think we'll get into all of that, and maybe that's a good segue to go ahead and keep moving forward onto our next slide, if I can. Okay, so for the conversation today, really what I wanted to start with was these three main categories, and first looking at when we're talking about developing an equity program, thinking about who, which is defining who is a social equity applicant, and then defining how, and so figuring out what are those services and benefits that a social equity applicant would be eligible for, and then figuring out what types of licenses should be included in a social equity program. So those are the first three questions, and we're going to chunk them out and take them one by one. And the first question, coming back to who and defining that social equity applicant, we talked a little bit about this at the last meeting, but just wanted to revisit it again because House Bill 2014-24 passed, and so I believe it's just awaiting signature of the governor at this point. So in this slide, there's a link to the bill. And what that bill does is it changes the term. What was previously accelerator license is now social equity licensee. And it changes the qualifications for the social equity applicant to be a Colorado resident, not subjected to an action against their license, and has to demonstrate one of the following: resided 15 or more years between 1980 and 2010 in an opportunity zone or disproportionately impacted area. They have to be have the applicant or an immediate family member who was arrested, convicted, or suffered civil asset forfeiture due to a marijuana offense. And then they cannot exceed the household income, which will be defined in rule by the MED. This social equity license, the bill also said that they have to hold 51% or more ownership of the license. And then while not related really to the license itself, but there was a late amendment to the bill that grants the governor the power to expedite pardons without consulting prosecutors and judges involved in prior marijuana convictions. And so my question for the work group, when we're talking about how to define a social equity applicant, we now have this guidance from the state through this bill. So curious about the work group's thoughts on whether Denver should align with this language that was recently adopted, add in a criteria, or can make some type of different consideration. So I'll throw that out there and see who wants to be the first to talk.
Can you leave that slide back up, and can someone walk through the income requirements? If we discussed the income barriers as the biggest challenge last time, can someone walk through why we want a cap on someone's income? I see Sarah on the call. Could you potentially walk us through that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we don't want to have a cap on income. If you look at, the chart right before, some of the programs have an income limitation and others don't. Programs that have had an income limitation have had a smaller pool of who can be available. So when during industry stakeholder, with actually the industry, there was still concerns about, well, there's other categories of people like veterans, LGBTQ, disabled, some people said Canna moms. How would they be able to qualify? And so in conversation, one of the things that we said, well, you only have to qualify for one. So if they don't fit under category 1 or 2, they could possibly fit under category 3 based on their income. And so that was from an industry standpoint. From a community standpoint, when we were doing stakeholder engagement with community members, one of the things that everyone was concerned about was an income cap as well. And so with our own community, Black and Brown community, what we wanted to do was see a higher income. So when we proposed the language to the governor's office, they felt that they didn't want the income to be too high, and they felt like there was a possibility that it was. So because of that, we would be able to determine the income in rulemaking.
So is that with the income piece of it? I get that we're trying to give access to low income individuals, but how it just doesn't make sense to me. So I wonder if that one doesn't make sense at the local level, because I feel like that one was designed for the rural applicants if they didn't meet any of the other ones, correct?
So here's the thing, where we found a nexus was, okay, let's say if you're a brown or Black person and you make over $50,000 a year, $50,000 isn't equivalent to really having an equitable opportunity to run a marijuana business, right? But we can't assume that all Black and brown people have the conviction or the arrest or the asset forfeiture. So there are still Black and brown people, especially given the median household income in Colorado, that might not qualify for one or two, but could also fit within the income. So I think the one of the things that we're going to have to do in rulemaking is maybe look at a tiered based system, or maybe look at, you know, if you qualify for all three, you get priority. But it's one of those double-edged swords, because if we were to say, well, no income, then anyone that makes under or over maybe 50,000 no longer qualifies. And those are a lot of the people that are going to be able to run an actual business. And so we just tried to figure out, how do we come to the table? How do we address the Black and brown people that are making a little bit more money but still need opportunities? And then how do we address all these other people that industry is concerned about? And so income was that bucket to catch all. I don't know, you know, what Denver would want to do on a local level. Some people are like, take out income altogether. If you do that, though, there will be Black and brown people that will not qualify for this. And if we're really focused on those communities, removing the income removes that opportunity for them.
That's not necessarily true.
Okay.
That's not necessarily true. I think that there's an opportunity in this situation. If you put revenue from some of the marijuana industry folks into a fund, that will be in a position to be able to help those folks who may not have the income to be able to participate.
Well, that's not the question. The question is, why is there an income category? And John, I'm just saying that based on the question, here's another point of view. Okay, so let me just bring it back. Why? The question is, why is there income? Income should be all the way removed. What I'm saying is that if we do remove income, which I would strongly recommend against, because through stakeholder process with industry and with Black and brown community, they did not want to have a qualification where the income was extremely low. And so we tried to make the income a little higher so that we can reach every one of them. But John, me and you have had this conversation. All Black and brown people have not had a cannabis conviction or have not lived in a neighborhood that's been negatively impacted. So if we're talking about having a more diverse and inclusive cannabis industry, and we remove an income option for people that have had a little bit of success, they no longer have an opportunity to participate. So, you know, we can peel that back a little more, but through all the months of stakeholder engagement that we did, that was always a concern for Black and brown people.
But that's Black and brown people that you may be talking to. Some of the ones that I'm talking to don't necessarily feel that way. And one of the things that I think can be dealt with is that if there is a fund to support folks then those folks who don't even meet the income criteria of $50,000 or more or less can find a way in if they're smart enough, work hard enough, can get the mentoring and support enough to be able to access the capital that's necessary for them to be successful. And that's just good mentoring relationship, which is what I think part of the accelerated licensing program is about.
Sarah, before you respond to that, I'm so sorry. It's just that we have Sean Coleman for a while wanting to speak as well as Jack. So can we go back to them and then go back to you? Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. And then let me just interject after Sean too. I don't know if Ian or somebody can speak to the timing of the rulemaking around this. That would be interesting to know too, just so that we can kind of figure out what that income level might be before we fully decide whether Denver would align with that.
And I just want to throw out there why I asked that question, Sarah, because I feel like with only needing to meet one of these, say for example, you have a young white college student who comes from privilege, who has a lot of access to capital, but currently meets the household income definition because maybe they don't have full-time work or whatever. They could capitalize on the social equity licensee opportunity and not necessarily be who we're targeting it for. And I bring that up because that's often what we see with a lot of affordable housing, who capitalizes on the affordable housing opportunities. And so I want to make sure that, you know, we're keeping it tailored to the group that it was intended for.
Yeah, I agree. And I know everyone wants to answer. I just want everyone to look at it from the complete opposite direction. If we're talking about social equity, which I know John is saying a fund, right? But we're talking about social equity criteria. If you have a Black and brown person that doesn't have a cannabis conviction and hasn't lived in any of these disproportionate impacted areas, the only other way in they have is through income. So if you take that income out, just know that you're going to take out Black and brown people as well. So it's like, it can't be perfect, but taking an income out is really going to take away opportunities from the people we're trying to help as well.
But that's where we go back to the conversation we had last week about why we're not being explicit about race and ethnicity here.
All right, go ahead, right. Sean. Oh, you're on mute though, Sean. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now? Okay, so the good news is that the state criteria are a baseline from which the city had its own criteria. So that's one bit of good news. But using this exact comment from Henny actually as an example of why it's important to have not only some state criteria, but then to look at, and I think Denver, as well as any community, can look at their specific examples of how they may tailor the criteria within their own community to their own needs, which is to say that an argument can be made, and I don't necessarily make it or don't make it, but the argument can be made that if there is a disparity in the health outcomes for minors in a community, that may be a result of the fact that of the custodianship of those businesses owners, right? So I am not going to say that a person who owns a business in community X and lives in community Y doesn't care about the kids and community X. That's not at all what I'm saying. What I am saying is, if there is a connection at all, then it would make sense and stand to reason that if there are opportunities for people to live, to own businesses within their own community, there might be, if not some positive public health benefit, at least an economic benefit to that community to mitigate any negative health effects, assuming there's no correlation to those things, right? So I think from that perspective, the city can look at things like, well, all right, in communities that have a high population of whatever kind of person you want to say, we're going to create a program that sets aside licenses for those communities, because we, as a community value, think that people owning businesses within the community in which they live is a value that we have. That's what, and when you look at the aspect of income, for example, right? So let's say that in a community that is a predominantly Black community, you have some people in that community who have gone on to college. So they were gone for some of the period, so they don't qualify because of the period. They were still Black where they were. They were still being followed by the cops where they were. They were still not getting the job applications where they were. So when they come home and want to participate in this economy, we should not, I think this is going to Sarah's point, we shouldn't be looking for ways to safeguard against the, white person who may have had some similar backgrounds, right? Because first of all, at the end of the day, there's going to be at both the state level and the municipal level, eyes looking at the application so we know who's applying. But I mean, I think, but I think more to the point, because we shouldn't minimize anybody's experience. The point of this program is that people who have a tangible relationship to the harms, societal harm, whether it's direct or indirect, should be able to benefit from the societal change, right? So I think that's why it's important that we look at not only what the state has as a floor from things that we can use as on a list of things to choose from for what the applicant could be, but then the city can look at things that are more specific to the things that people we say we care about. I've heard from many people in many different ways of saying it that the disconnect between the ownership of businesses and who lives in those communities is an issue that the city would like to look at, that people think that's a value. So I think that could be potentially one of the criteria. How you do that exactly, that's why we all get here to discuss. But just that's, but as as a concept, I think that is something that we can look at.
Okay, good thoughts.
Sorry, one more thing. I'm going to add to all that. That I think specifically to look at those things. I think that the license classes of hospitality and new dispensaries when they become available are particularly interesting in those regards, because since those are community-facing businesses, unlike manufacturing and what other businesses, it also does give that sense of that people are looking at business owners that look like them in the community. So I think that hospitality and new dispensaries are particularly interesting in that context of if there's going to be a class of
Great. Ian, do you have anything to share as far as timing of rulemakings or when those income thresholds would be set?
Rulemaking is going to begin this summer. Can everybody hear me? I'm hearing myself. Rulemaking is going to begin this summer. I don't know exactly when. I anticipate that it'll happen late July or early August, and then go through the fall. Obviously, everything needs to be done and promulgated in time for a January 1st start date. Or maybe that's not obvious. That's in the statute. I apologize. If that may not be obvious to everybody.
Got it. Thank you. So any other thoughts from anybody on these three criteria or on the 51% ownership?
Jackie and then Truman.
Okay, great.
Jackie.
Sorry, go ahead.
Jackie Floyd from Grizzly. Molly, to your question, everybody has jumped to the 3 points, but as an attorney, I'm looking at this, and you raised the issue the last meeting that as Colorado being first, that it's not so easy to be first, and there might have been some mistakes made, and Colorado has this patchworks of different municipalities and different laws. So I think a first question before you get to these three categories is, has it benefited Denver to have things different than the state rules, or does it benefit Denver more to be in line with the state rules?
So that's a great question, and I think unfortunately the answer is it depends, and it depends on what we're talking about. I think there's always a benefit to consistency and alignment, and so we could be as clear as possible. But then there's also matters of local concern where Denver might be a little bit different than some other areas. As the largest jurisdiction in the state, and so there might be some different criteria that we may want to look at here. But again, anytime there's consistency and alignment, I think there's a pro to that as well. Truman, did you want to add something?
Sorry, Jacqueline, I jumped in there. Apologies. Yeah, two things. I think the first is I would caution people against assuming that minority business owners will definitely start businesses in the exact communities in which they live. That may happen, but it may not happen. The city's zoning rules are quite clear and are very restrictive when it comes to cannabis. And my prediction is that whoever gets these licenses will just take the location that they can find. Having hunted through, many maps of the cities, it's not easy to find a place that will work. And so I might just separate those. And I feel like I had something else, but I'll save it until I can remember. Sorry.
Councilwoman Sudabaka next.
I would add to the previous question about whether it makes sense to be in alignment with the state or not. I think in Denver, it makes more sense for us to be more specific because we have the largest portion of the state's share of people of color. And so while at the state level, it's broader to include more people, including those in rural areas. I think at the local level, it's important for us to be as explicit as possible because with the level of with the floor that the state has set, it's still super vague and will not address the populations we're trying to touch because the majority of poor people are white. And so if you have that category in there, we could still end up with still less than 5 or 10 Black or brown owners in the city of Denver.
So Councilwoman, do you have another suggestion of another criteria that you would recommend? And I guess I would put that question out to everybody.
Yes, I think we should eliminate the does not exceed household income. And I think we should be explicit and add belongs to a minority group. The way that we do in our DISBO ordinance, we can use DISBO language as well.
Jessica Scardina next.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to make a couple of points with respect to alignment with the state regulations. The first is that I think it's a lot easier to see compliance from licensees when the state and local regulations are in alignment. And the second is that because Denver has the majority of the licensees and is one of the biggest municipalities, a lot of other smaller local jurisdictions look to Denver for guidance on how to draft their regulations and what to include. And this results a lot of times in those other jurisdictions changing the regulations a little bit to tailor them to their jurisdiction, which leads to discrepancies across the state and municipalities. So I think for ease, for a lot of licensees and regulators, alignment with the state first and foremost is pretty important.
Henny Leslie next.
Go ahead, Henny.
Apologies, I had myself on mute. I'd like just to offer a slight difference of opinion on that. The state has given us guidelines, but we work with municipalities all over the state. And oftentimes, while Denver is looked to, there are municipalities that have certain nuances that appreciate the flexibility that the state gives the guidelines and the overall regulations, but then municipalities still do want the right to be able to tweak down on certain things or that their community's best. So thank you.
Any other comments or suggestions for alternative criteria or thoughts on Councilwoman Sudabaka's proposal or anything in general? Okay. How about on the 51% or more ownership of the license? And I guess let me clarify too, right? So the definition that the state has set in this bill is for the accelerator or now the social equity license. And so, you know, as we move in to talk about the next pieces of what the benefits and services are and what licenses they would be available. So while we may have, you know, we could have a different definition from the state, it would be applicable to different types of licenses as well. And it would be applicable to the local licenses. So anything on the 51% or more ownership, or I don't know, Sarah, if you have any thoughts or anybody that was involved with this bill around how that will be kind of regulated?
Well, almost actually every single social equity plan has that 51% ownership, and that's just to stop predatory practicing, but it happens no matter what. And I do have a comment. This is outside of this, but I think that we need to be real about what success looks like. And with the current market, the way delivery is written, the way hospitality is written, the way with the cap being open, or not the cap being open, but the lottery being pushed out, there is not going to be 50 new social equity licensees and businesses rolling out. Right now, we have been able to identify 3. The reality of this looks like maybe 10 groups of businesses are going to come into the market. And so with that being said, when we're talking about what the criteria is, do we want to add race to it? We also need to look at the business standpoint for these people as well. When you make it more difficult, when you add more barriers, guess what? The industry is continuing to move, but the social equity person is at a halt because now someone's saying, well, it shouldn't be race-based, or someone's saying, well, the income is too low. But you still have these little 10 to 15 people out here that qualify that now can't participate. And so I really think, like, on this call, I would really like to hear people talk about, you know, what does success look like and how can we fast track that? Because we don't have time. We're running out of time. This stuff is happening in January 2021. And I think that, you know, we really need to focus on that more so than anything, is how do we get more people in? How many people does that really look like? And how do we do it as fast as possible?
Michelle Garcia has a comment.
I think I have a question for Sarah. Disproportionately impacted area, how is that determined? Who determines it? Is that something that's already predetermined? How small is the area? Just a little bit more information on that clause, please. Thank you.
Absolutely, Michelle. So in other states, when you look at disproportionate impacted area, it's been states that have high cannabis arrest, high police enforcement, maybe, you know, high drug use. It's basically neighborhoods and communities that have been marginalized, and it's all based on, you know, the income, poverty, all those things take into effect. One of the things that the MED had came back to us and said was, hey, well, when we look at how every other state was able to define these disproportionately impacted areas, we see that there had to be, like, you know, some research done or some type of group put together. So we still have opportunity zone in there, but we expanded the time for opportunity zone based on, you know, what Councilwoman Cita Baca had told us about the dates when opportunity zones were happening and what they are now. And then we took language from every other policy and made sure that, okay, well, if the opportunity zone piece doesn't fit, we can still, in rulemaking, determine the disproportionate impacted area. So I hope that answers your question.
So that would be something that could be determined by the statistical neighborhoods at the city county. Oh,
yes.
Great. And
yes,
looking at disproportionality in terms of arrests and incarceration relative to income. Okay,
Yeah, all those things. And I think even too, with SMART, with Henny, it could also even be determined by, you know, where you have the highest use for children or minors that are of minority. And just, this is a different comment, but Henny, you know, we've been thinking about that too. Like, how do we make sure that if we know that our Black and brown children are using more and we're having social equity businesses and people come in that are Black and brown and owning these businesses, you know, I think it's very important that social equity candidates be held to a same standard, and if not even higher. Like, you know, there needs to be corporate social responsibility programs. There needs to be something wrapped into that program about how we work with SMART to have youth prevention, and how we make SMART maybe a little bit more diverse, so that, you know, when you're out here and you're speaking to these kids, they're seeing people that are representative of how they look, and that might be telling them, hey, this can be an amazing business, but this is not something that you should do for many amounts of reasons. And then, you know, we were kind of throwing out, maybe now we can even have some scholarship funds for our children. So I definitely want to talk more, maybe offline with you, about what we can do to make sure that looks right in social equity.
Councilwoman Sitibaka is next.
Just adding, I think in Denver, we can be very specific about disproportionately impacted areas, because it directly coincides or aligns with historic redlining. And so the inverted L is the well-known area of disproportionate impact. And in Denver, we can be explicit and call that out because everybody's familiar with the tracks that includes.
I would agree.
Okay, sorry, I was trying to unmute. Okay, so I think that's a great segue into, because I think after we get through these next two questions, we're going to get into some of those technical pieces that, to Sarah's point, we can look at how to reduce those barriers of the existing framework as well. So I'll move on to the next question here, which is, what services and benefits should be developed for and available to those social equity applicant? And so this is similar, or it's pretty much the same as what we had presented a couple or 2 weeks ago at the last meeting. A lot of these ideas here are basically from other programs that exist in other cities and states, and also came up as ideas or suggestions or barriers to entry that were brought up through the analytic insight study that we presented 2 weeks ago as well. So looking at what some ideas are for services and benefits, I think we've mentioned most of them with this group as well, but looking at prioritizing licensing distribution or processing, both for the new license types as well as licenses released under the lottery. And then also looking at modified application requirements. There's lots of those, including possession of property, proof of financial capability, location requirements. We'll get into those a little bit as well later on. Looking at workforce development or mentorship programs. I know NCIA just kicked off a new mentorship program that maybe Clarissa can speak to. Looking at technical assistance, legal clinics, or business plan development, financial assistance. I think that's John mentioned those a little bit ago, talking around low interest loans, business resources, B2B networking events, development of ancillary businesses, and then obviously the other category. These are not intended to be the only ideas out there. So would love to hear from the rest of you. These are a lot of ideas, and we could probably spend a whole session on each one of these. So would love to hear from a lot of you on just kind of like pick one, talk about one of these as which one you think we should focus on. I mean, we don't have to only pick one, but I think I would just like to hear from each of you. If you could kind of focus or prioritize one or two of them, what would you pick? And then also in our written comments template, what we did is we listed all of these, and we are asking you and the members of the public to rank them and kind of see where we could prioritize and focus some effort on to get moving quickly, and where we would kind of be the most effective. So thoughts on that from anybody? Clarissa, you want to talk about your mentorship program?
I'm happy to share it. I appreciate the opportunity, Molly, and thank you for everyone for their comments today. Always very great process to learn from the needs of our community all around. In late 2018, NCI began developing a plan, a pretty hefty plan to tackle social inequity in the space. As you guys know, we're a nonprofit, so things do take a little bit longer. But we've been moving steady ever since. In 2019, we launched a report with 6 achievable goals for our policymakers around addressing issues like discriminatory enforcement of prohibition, potential of tax revenue investments out of the tax dollars, as well as some of these great financial barriers, as well as equity in creating licensing, which is what we're doing here in Denver. So again, I commend the city of Denver for doing that. And in just this week, we launched, actually it was last week, we launched phase 2 of our plan as designed. So we're very happy and very excited to share with the community that we have launched a social equity scholarship program. This involves several benefits that we're offering, not just for opportunities for businesses in the industry to get involved in making a solution out of a problem we've all been a part of, but also for applicants and potential, and also licensee holders already of social equity all over the US in this regulated market. So what the program includes, and there's more information on the website, I'm happy to share this with the public through VIA, perhaps in the most appropriate way for the link for the public and the community to access the information in full. But we're basically offering complimentary annual membership for all social equity applicants across the nation. And that includes access to some pretty great benefits, because you guys know membership really, these benefits, they give business owners a leg up on competition. They unlock quite a few opportunities between networking and technical development, professional development as far as our university and CIA. We also will be offering an exclusive mentorship program along the lines of matchmaking, which was what we discussed last meeting. This will be ongoing program with monthly meetings where we're going to be pairing businesses participating in the space with social equity applicants and licensees. Also, so on license holders as well. We're also offering 25% off all of our membership sponsorships, pardon me, to the program participants. And ultimately, and also offering, when we're back to normal life, because we do hope to be back to real life, we're offering complimentary tickets to all of our trade shows, our business, our B2B trade shows. So this is the program as is today. Obviously, we're always evolving, so we're always open to feedback. And ultimately, what we're doing, I run the business development department in CIA, and what my team and I are doing is every single conversation we have on the phone with our customers today, businesses in the space, we're absolutely talking about this, asking them to get engaged, asking them to participate, asking them to ensure that they do have not just, like John said earlier, a financial stake in this, but also a professional development and technical support role through the mentorship program. So that's really the gist of it. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Again, that's the best avenue. You let me know. I'm happy to share that link through your magic here on the tech side.
Yeah, send it to my email. I can share with the group on the chat, and then we can figure out a way to send it to the public.
Great, thank you. Anybody else want to kind of look at these ideas around services and benefits and tell us if any of these rise to the top for you, and or if you have anything else as an idea that we have not listed here that's something that we should be considering as a service or benefit to a social equity applicant based on the criteria that we discussed on the previous slide.
Truman Bradley.
Hi, Truman Bradley, Marijuana Industry Group. I would suggest that the city look at what its core capabilities are here. And I think really what that comes down to is, prioritize license distribution or processing of some kind and financial assistance. I don't think the city is the best partner when it comes to technical assistance in the cannabis space. Frankly, I think that we are, and we are working with the Color of Cannabis and other groups on this call to roll out some programs to help in that area. I am hopeful, even in the time of COVID, that the city can put its money where its mouth is when it comes to social equity, and figure out a way to do that. And so I would choose the two on the left side for the city.
Councilwoman Sidbaka and then Jack Flood.
I agree on the prioritization and the financial assistance. I think there should be some kind of impact fee or dedicated revenue stream to create grants, not just low interest loans. And I think under the workforce development, there should be support for cooperative development, because co-ops can eliminate or alleviate some of the burden of the overhead cost and the individual costs if those costs are shared.
Hi. Hey, this is Jacqueline Flug from Drizzly. I'm really happy that Truman, I think you're the first one here who's even referenced COVID, that we're sort of talking about this in a vacuum, and that when you talk about the access to capital and the financial assistance, I don't think that can be overstressed at this time. How if that is not there, you're just setting up this program for failure. So I think if access to capital definitely has to be the top priority if you want to see a successful program.
Do we have room for somebody else?
Yeah, there's no one in queue, John, so you can go ahead.
Well, you know, I think all of these are good tools that could be useful. But, you know, ultimately, it's going to come down to where are going to be the funds to implement this infrastructure. Is all of this going to be housed in excise and license? And is excise and license based on these 8 components up here, have the staff to be able to make sure that all of these things are being done? And I don't say that as anything other than a partner who's either trying to figure out where there are additional dollars for you to do the work, or transferring the conversation back to Truman, where he said he's working on some things with some people in the area. I mean, I think, quite frankly, the industry ought to be dealing with a lot of this based on a recognition of what the city can and cannot do.
Clarissa here with NCIA. John, thank you so much for the comments. Same for Truman. Just such important discussions. There is no doubt that there's a couple nuances here that I would like to know. I agree 100% that the industry should be contributing to this, and not just, but as well as financially is what I'm getting at, not just through mentorship. But we do have to recognize that, especially the companies that are making the most money in the space, and certainly at this time of COVID, because we're talking about now, are going to be companies selling cannabis, because that's the essential service, and all of the ancillary companies as well. But with that said, we have to recognize that the industry also abides to federal prohibition, which under 280E does not allow for the industry to really completely thrive at its full potential. The plant touching companies and everyone that surrounds them are paying upwards to 70% income tax sometimes. So it's a false sense that we're swimming in money. Now, that is not to be said that we cannot contribute, and we will, but I wanted to note that because this goes beyond COVID. It's all about prohibition being the problem behind all of this, behind social equity problems, behind all of this that we're gathered here to solve through this regulated market and new policies around cannabis. So with that said, again, we are absolutely encouraging our members at the national level. I know that Truman as well is. He does stellar work here in Colorado with his organization. So John, we are absolutely behind you, but I wanted to note that. And our second note is what we've heard time after time from applicants in other cities is that the need for financial support does not end once they get that license. In fact, that need continues, and the fact most of them fail a year into this, 2 years into this, because their need for capital streams is ongoing. So I do like the idea of the fund, John. I'm not sure how we could operationalize that, but we're open to discussing this. And I think, Truman, maybe we ought to have a conversation as well, if any way that we can support you locally here, because we are focused on national policy, but I don't see why we couldn't have a conversation and see if there's any way we could support your work locally as well.
I would caution us to not use the tax increment or tax scenario or any of that relative to the social equity conversation. While it's okay, but it smells of the same conversation we had when we talked about why we didn't deal with social equity in the first place. It's because we didn't think about it or there were other things on the agenda. And I'm saying it really doesn't make a difference. We made marijuana and cannabis essential. So I for one, really don't want to hear about their trials and tribulations, because I got 8 years and $808 billion worth of weight and 400 years of bondage here that suggests that there's some things that we can do now and without taking those things into consideration.
Truman is next. Sorry, Truman.
Okay, go ahead, Truman.
Couple of things. John, I hear you on the $8 billion. That's top line revenue. And so what I'll say there is, if you take a look at the Colorado cannabis industry, there's industry consolidation happening right now. And the reason that's happening is because the small and mid-tier players are losing market share and getting squeezed out. And the reason why these companies are struggling is because of IRS code 280E. And so I get it that the Black and brown communities have been excluded from this industry. That's messed up. It's not right. We've talked about it. You and I are aligned on this. And I do think that the industry should play a role in helping, as you say, to, I don't know, clean up the water from a well that we didn't dig. But what I will say is, number one, the amount of money that you would be able to get from the industry is peanuts compared to what the city and the state are able to do, even in times of COVID. The city of Denver and the state of Colorado lose more money in the couch cushions than you'll ever be able to get from industry. And it's important to recognize where the ability to do the most amount of good is in each one of these boxes up here. Can industry help out? Absolutely, and it should. And you and I are working together on ways that we can do that. But I would like to see the city step up to the plate as well.
I think the city will step up to the plate, but I think that we abdicate our responsibility if we think that in the midst of a budget shortfall, the city is going to be able to, the state is going to be able to step up. One of the reasons that I think I made the statement about the essential piece is because while federal government, state government, and cities work from home in many cases, the cannabis industry was still open and y'all were still selling product. So while you and I work and we will continue this discussion, that doesn't work for me. This current explanation doesn't work for me.
And while we like to think that the city will step up, the city has hardly stepped up at all for Black and brown people in any form or fashion.
But I think also, that's Councilwoman Cedar Baca who made that statement. My history suggests, and I mentioned this in the last conversation, that having done this work in beverage, having done it in newspaper, and done it in hotel, all of these services and benefits and this valuable intellectual property we're sharing here today, all right, it comes back down to whether or not owner-operators in the industry have the will. The city can put all this together, the state can put all this together, but if there's no will, there's going to continue to be a struggle. And so that's why I, for one, continue to say, let's be active, let's be bold, let's be stable, but let's also hold the industry accountable. And that's why if you saw the email I've sent y'all over the last couple of times, the industry report card is the only thing that is going to move us, because there's no good faith here. Because again, to restate it, we are 8 years and $8 billion later. Within that 8 years and $8 billion, we've had multiple opportunities to do the right thing that had nothing to do with legislation. So because we have legislation now, while that sounds good and feels good, there's some things that we could be doing 2 weeks ago, 3 years ago, 5 years ago, and we haven't done it. And so my point is the industry has to do what has to be done. And going back to what this young lady said when we started this conversation, if there's going to be social equity, it'll be because it comes from the community. Because industry, no government, know what social equity looks like. None of us do. And so in some cases, we won't even know it when we see it.
So Molly, this is Ken Allison. My question, the first two issues that you had up, say if you had 10 people apply for a license and 6 of those were minority, would all 6 of those individuals get in if they qualify, or would it be reduced to 1 or 2 out of 10?
I'm trying to unmute just a second. Okay, so can you guys hear me? So that's a good question. So you're referring to it. So how that kind of work is under the prioritized licensing or prioritized distribution.
Hey Molly. Hey Molly.
Yeah.
Terrible echo.
Yep. Somebody else want to try explaining it?
I don't know if Abby or Eric are.
Ken?
If I can make a comment by way, I'll try to take a stab at it if that's okay.
Please.
So there are many ways to do a preferred license program. I'm going to, again, advocate for hospitality being a good candidate for a program by way of explaining how one could potentially work. But again, you can do as many you want, right? So let's say, for example, that you had those 6 applicants that were the qualified equity applicant in a pool of 100 applicants, right? So the first question is, how many licenses are there? Because if there's 106 licenses, it doesn't really matter. Everybody can have one, right? So the question only comes into play if there are a limited amount of licenses. So I think the theory, right, is that it's not a permanently limited class of licenses. What it is at the beginning of this process, and I use hospitality as an example because there are no hospitality licenses at all today, so it's a tabula rasa to discuss. You could say for X amount of licenses that we're going to set aside for an equity applicant, we will allow a certain amount of non-equity applicants to then become licensed through that process, right? So in other words, you have sort of 2 processes that go on at the same time. The equity applicant is unlimited amount of licenses within that class of equity. And again, this is one way to do it, not the way, right? So but you would have an unlimited amount of licenses available for the equity applicant for a period, let's say the period's 1 year, right? In that 1 year period, for every applicant, because not all the applicants are going to be qualified. So whoever comes to the door, they come in, great. So let's say the ratio is 5 to 1. That means after the 5th equity applicant is approved, then the city would have availability for the non-equity applicants based on that limitation. Because for every 5 equity applicants that are approved, it creates a new license for a non-equity applicant, right? The ratio can be whatever you choose it to be, but the idea is that you have both a pathway for the equity applicants to participate in effectively free market, and then the free market is limited for some time period to allow that unregulated, that free market to sort of organically allow those business owners to become successful in their own right. So that way they're all kind of competing together. That's not the way, that's just one way to do it. But the idea being that the equity licenses in effect create the non-equity licenses as they're approved.
Thank you, Sean. I see Candy Sidbaka and Sarah Woodson with comments, but can I just test Molly's audio real quick? No, Molly, can you try to log in again while I put Candy and Sarah on queue? Can you get out and get in with your headphones plugged on the computer while you do it? Thank you. Councilwoman, if you want to take over, I apologize.
Yeah, thank you. I don't feel like there should be any openings for non-equity licenses at this point. When you have in Denver almost 1,000 licenses and less than 10 of them, maybe 5, belong to people of color, why would we open up any non-social equity licenses at this point at all?
Thank you, Councilwoman. Sarah, your turn.
Well, to Ken's point, just to kind of talk a little bit more what Sean was talking about, we've seen different states do it in different ways, right? So, and this is the one thing that we never talk about because we consistently are late to the table. Equity needs to be talked about in the distribution of medical licenses because those come first. And they always have first access to retail, but that's a whole nother conversation. Hopefully we'll catch on eventually and stop talking about equity and retail only. But for instance, California had a 3-tier rollout, right? So tier 1, that was medical. They come first. They get to get their licenses first. The same thing that they're doing in Chicago. But what California said was, okay, we're going to have priority processing. So that means the first between this time, only equity applicants or companies that have 51% equity ownership can apply, right? But you see, the biggest problem that people aren't wanting to acknowledge is when you look at each and every single one of these programs, if you do not have cooperation, kind of what John was saying, but I just look at it a little bit differently. If you don't have cooperation from industry when it comes to how these things look, you will still have the same outcome because it's a money game. So if you don't have the proper cooperation, you'll still have the same outcome. So California right now is a mess because, again, there's been Black and brown people, not many of them, maybe 50 or 60, that are now stuck in a war between what California thought they were doing amazing and what industry did not want to happen. And so industry's still rolling, but you have your 50 or 60 people that are now drowning, losing their businesses. They put all their money into this. So that's just one example. What we are suggesting is neutral policy. When it comes to the retail and cultivation left in Denver, I agree with Candy Sidbaka. Those should go to social equity applicants only. I don't know for how long. We're thinking 36 months. We've been talking to industry, and I'm hearing industry saying, yeah, we think that's fair. The program that Sean and Art built that we just amended as a group collectively now has an opportunity for franchising. So retail and cultivation technically could be franchised on these few remaining 8 dispensaries or 10 cultivations, because that's the reality. And the other thing is that there can be no more new dispensaries in Candy Sidbaka's location, because that's something else we haven't spoke about, is that the density doesn't allow for it. And so, you know, there's just so many pieces to it, but we need to think about the equitable piece and making sure Black and brown people are involved. But we also need to think about that this is not just the social justice, this is for economic access as well. And so if we're not thinking about the business aspects of it, the people that we're fighting for end up losing. And that is what you've seen happen across the country. Equity is not winning because the advocates and the industry don't know how to create policy that both agree on. We have to find a medium for everyone. And that's why we're suggesting 1-for-1s, hospitality, delivery, cultivation, the rest of cultivation in Denver, and the rest of retail goes to equity for a certain point of time. Then we start talking about how do we make the accelerator program work. Otherwise, we're going to be like everyone else, and it's not going to be successful. And passing legislation is one thing, but implementing it is a whole nother ballgame. And if we don't work together, we're not going to be able to have any more Black or brown people in the industry, period. Sorry, I get a little passionate about this stuff, but I mean, this is my life, you know, like every day I wake up. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
So thank you. Oh,
if I could just
go ahead.
Add to that.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it. You know, another way to look at it is to go back to Councilwoman DeBacco's point. No new licenses unless equity licenses have been dealt with. If we talk about legislation, we talk about policy, but legislation and policy mean nothing unless you change the culture. And so unless you change the culture, all of this is good conversation or not.
Actually, that worked out perfectly because these two comments actually just link together, right? Because when you talk about using hospitality again as an example, what does not exist today is the culture around cannabis hospitality. When Sarah's talking about the business viability, well, if I open a steakhouse, I have some expectation of success because people have been to a steakhouse before. They know what a steakhouse is, and people are going to be looking for steakhouses, not just mine, steakhouses in general. So the entire universe of people looking for steakhouses, those people might end up at my door. Nobody today is looking for a cannabis hospitality business because nobody knows what it is. Nobody knows who that audience is. We know they exist because otherwise there wouldn't be citations for public consumption. So we know these people exist, but what they want, where do they want to go? Nobody knows. So I think it's vitally important that that space is diverse. Now, fortunately, we're talking about equity and diversity, so that sort of kind of goes hand in hand. That if you want to have a diverse marketplace, you're going to have diversity in it. But that includes business owners from all variety of backgrounds, and all who are seeking all different types of audiences. Because if it doesn't really matter how interesting my unicorn museum is, if I'm the only unicorn museum, then nobody's going to come because sooner or later the novelty will go away. So you can't have, for a period of 5 years, 2 hospitality businesses and expect those businesses to succeed. They can't because there's no culture around it. You need to have a critical mass of those businesses, which is why whatever the ratio is and I think the same is for delivery as well. The idea of creating the consumer expectation that this service is available, whatever the ratio it is, whether 1-to-1, 5-to-1, that's a good policy discussion. But I think that there needs to be a ratio because otherwise you don't get the critical mass of businesses and no one succeeds. And that's just economics. Doesn't matter what you're talking about.
Great, thank you. So sorry, I might have missed some of those pieces of conversation as I hopped off. And is the audio better now, Thea?
A little echo, but let's keep going and see what happens.
Okay. All right, hopefully it is because I'm going to have a bunch of slides to walk through here in just a minute. So what I'm summarizing from what I think I just heard is most people prioritize license distribution and processing as well as financial.
No, Molly, no, I'm sorry, no. Can I propose a suggestion? Can Erica take over just for the presentation of the next slides while you try to call in, like shut everything down from your computer, just the image, let the image on, shut the sound and call from your phone, and let's see if that works. And Erica, let me give you 2 minutes. Can you get queued for the PowerPoint presentation? Is that okay? And sorry, Erica, to put you on the spot like that. And she texted me, she's just asking for a second. She's gonna get queued.
Okay. Can people hear me?
Yes, but there's also an echo.
How about now?
That's better. Thank you.
Okay, sorry, I was on my desktop so I could see everything and take notes on my computer, and I had to switch to my laptop so I could speak. So I think what Molly was getting at is that what we're hearing from the comments are that people are prioritizing funding and some sort of priority licensing system, and there's clearly some different ideas about what that system could look like. And that's good, and that's really good discussion. But does anyone have any other ideas about things that they want to see aside from that prioritized? Or are those kind of the, group's thoughts that those are the most important things?
I have an idea about funding.
Okay.
So when we were working on the state legislation, which was the part where Wanda was working on getting funding, and then we had the definition piece. One of the things that we had went through is we went through the budget and we looked at all the, budget items and lines. And we immediately noticed that there are massive budgets that are going towards criminal justice, the police, etc. And I think that now that we're having this conversation, and I like to call it reallocating funds, because clearly you need police, you need law and order. So I like to call it reallocating and redistributing funds. Now that we're having a conversation around there, I think it would be really nice to look at what that fund is in Denver, which I believe it's like $200+ million, and see if there's an opportunity or a way that we can collectively take some money from that fund and then drop it in an equity bucket. I think that would be one of the most progressive ways to go about that. And I think right now, council and society and all people involved have an appetite for that. So that's just something that I wanted to put out there to give some thought about funding on a city level.
Great, thank you for that. We do have a slide that will talk about funding a little bit later, but we'll make sure we note your comments in the minutes. So I'm working on pulling up the slides right now, so we can kind of continue and go to the next question. But what it's going to be is the question about, we've talked about who should the applicant be, what kinds of things should we offer, and we've talked about some priorities there. And then we've sort of kind of launched into this when we talked about, what the priorities are, but for which license types, right? Several of you have made comments that the formula should look a little different for existing licenses versus the new licenses. So does anyone have any additional comments about, there's the chunk of licenses that come from stores and centers and grows that have caps on them and are currently, existing in our licensing system versus the hospitality and delivery. Like I said, anyone have any additional comments on that?
This is Hanny Lastly with Smart. I couldn't find my chat button quick enough. I have a question. If these are new license types, and say you have ABC dispensary that's going to apply for a hospitality location that's, say, for example, next door to the dispensary, how are we going to handle the concern around density with respect to neighborhoods that have already been oversaturated? And is that a separate conversation? Because, we have the data around tobacco and liquor that outlet density definitely impacts youth use rates. And I think our concern around this and how this is going to be handled is what happens with that when it comes to talking about caps and licenses, but also, let's just pile it on with COVID, right? I mean, the budget, we watched CDPHE's marijuana education prevention programs evaporate. The same thing's going to happen at the city. We know it. And so how all that conversation has to happen is just something that we need to be on the record that we're deeply concerned about. And so the question, I guess, Molly, to you is that how does, if everybody has the opportunity to open a hospitality license that already has an existing dispensary, how does that not immediately double the licenses numbers in Denver? Thank you.
No, Molly, no sound. Erica, do you want to answer that, or should we put a pin on it and come back to?
So we actually have a question like that in one of our later slides talking about existing our existing framework and the caps and the provisions that talk about saturation. So Henny, if it's okay, maybe we can dive into that when we get to that slide.
Oh, of course.
Okay. All right, so I think then if we'll hop back in, Molly, if we want to go to the slide on identify licenses available to social equity applicants, that third blue box at the top. Do we have any other kind of feedback on which license type should be available to social equity applicants, or should we move on?
I don't think I got any resolution or response to my question about why we would be awarding any non-equity licenses when we have almost 1,000 licenses and less than 10 of them are people who would qualify as social equity licensees.
So I think that's something we don't know the answer to right now. That's, we're kind of getting feedback, and so it sounds like you're advocating for not issuing any licenses to non-equity applicants, and so we'll note that as your position. We've got, like I said, some other ideas about how to do that, but those both fall into that, priority being some sort of a licensing system that prioritizes equity applicants. So,
well, I think it's a bigger question than that. I think the city needs to define what proportion is equity. What proportion of ownership is the ultimate goal that we're trying to achieve?
And do you have any recommendations for what you think our goals should be?
Yeah, I mentioned them last time, and I thought you guys were going to come back to the table with some data about proportionality around arrests, convictions, and jail time for Black and Brown people during the war on drugs. Because if we're trying to undo the harm caused by the war on drugs, why wouldn't we connect the proportionality of licenses to the disproportionality of convictions, arrests, and sentencing?
And Erica, before you respond that, Molly, can you try your phone real quick? I see that you're logged in. Say something.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes,
Hello?
that's perfect.
Okay.
Yay.
Sorry,
Sorry.
everybody. Okay. Sorry, I missed the conversation in the most recent question. So, I think it was Councilwoman Sita Baca. Do you want to pose it again?
Actually, I think it would be helpful if someone from Excise and Licensing paraphrased what I just asked to see if you're understanding it.
Sure, I'll take a stab and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like you were hoping that we would have a more solidified definition of what disproportionality is in Denver based on arrest data and other data points from the war on drugs. So I know we've shared some last time. Well, let me first ask, is that the correct question?
Kind of. I'm hoping that data will inform our goal for equity.
So Councilman Sitibaka is saying that, however, disproportionate Black and Brown people were by the war on drugs. So if Black and Brown people were 50% more arrested than white people, that therefore the licensing should reflect that as a percentage for the go to be for the equity program.
Exactly.
So
Okay.
So I understand your proposal, Councilwoman, and I think in the most recent email that I sent to you at the beginning of the week, I did send to you that data that we have from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, and so I don't have it right in front of me at the moment, so I forget what the percentage was. But what your proposal then is that our goal for equity in licensing be that all types of licenses reflect that same percentage. Is that what your proposal is, Councilwoman?
That the balance does, yes, correct.
The balance, what do you mean the remaining licenses? That any license that gets issued based on that percentage?
Yes, so say for example, we go with that 50%. And we have new license types open up. Well, we only will award those to social equity applicants until we reach a balance, until we reach the 50% balance in total licenses. And then we'll start allowing the 1-for-1 back and forth of equity licensee, non-equity licensee, to maintain the proportionality that we're aiming for.
So I guess I'd like to hear everybody else's reactions to that concept and that proposal from the Councilwoman.
This is Sarah Woodson, the color of cannabis. So I do see exactly what the Councilwoman's saying. Here's the problem, or here's what's a little problematic about that. Let's just look at delivery, right? And the way that delivery is written. So as of right this second, if Denver opted in a day or two, medical only can deliver. What we want to do is make sure that when 2021 comes around, transporters can deliver. And those transporters will be social equity transporters, and they will also have a transporter permit. So if you have a large landscape like Denver that has the most dispensaries in Colorado, and you say, well, only social equity can operate until we get up to 50%. Well, the dispensaries don't have to use an outside transporter. And so what happens is then the people that are ready, that qualify for social equity, they miss that first mover's advantage to the market, because if there's only 4 social equity dispensary companies, they're not going to be able to cater to the entire market. So that's why we were thinking on the same, almost the same as you, as the 50%, but we were thinking as soon as it happens. So that way people are ready, can participate. But if you're not ready, you don't miss out, or you're not in a space where by the time you get ready, there's no more opportunity. Because with the 1-for-1, you give out a license. If there is a social equity, you give it out, or either you sit it aside. But we could get to a place where if we decided to go that route, let's say 2022, there's now a cap, but there's not over 50%, then all those people that we're trying to get to participate would have now missed out. So while I just want to finish 1 second. I just want to finish, please. Thank you. While the concept of it is extremely noble, when you put the business piece on top of it, you're still risking a certain group of people missing out on opportunities, because we're trying to make sure only those group of people get the opportunity. So it could be a catch-22. Thank you.
I appreciate your interpretation, but that's not what I was saying. Okay. So there wouldn't be a time limit on the 1-for-1. We wouldn't do 1-for-1 until we reach the 50% proportionality.
Can I ask a question, Councilwoman? But for licenses like the dispensaries and the cultivation, where we have already 5 historical years, and we're gonna, because of the cap, we're only gonna be able to issue 10, 15 licenses. How do we make 10, 15 get to being half of 1,000 when we're not gonna have those licenses to give? Because I feel like maybe you're setting this goal up for failure, on the sense that if our goal is to reach 50% or 50% plus being the number of arrests, how do we set that if we only have 10 licenses to distribute?
that's exactly what I brought up many meetings ago when I said that we shouldn't be able to just sell licenses without taking into consideration the social equity applicants who are eligible for those licenses. When we talked about how a white business is likely to sell their license to another white business owner and they wouldn't have to access the social equity applicants, that was what I was getting at, is that you're never going to get equity with the way that we allow current licensees to sell their license to anybody without having to go through the social equity applicant pool first.
Thank you for clarification.
But ultimately, the point is that if any new licenses open up, that they should all be going to social equity applicants until there is a balance in who owns the licenses.
And that's the thing. There will never be a balance. There will never be a balance. And
then there should be no new licenses that create or deepen the imbalance.
So if I'm hearing you correct, you're saying that you would rather there be no new licenses for social equity candidates than to create 10 to 15 more opportunities, because there's a possibility that it would deepen the imbalance of more white people having licenses?
No new licenses for non-social equity applicants. Only social equity applicants would be eligible for new licenses.
So, okay, so I guess my question to you then is, if we say only the licenses that are already existing, which would be the cultivation and retail, those would all go to social equity candidates. In doing stakeholder engagement with Black and Brown people, that is something that every single person wants. And that's also something that I'm hearing that industry is willing to support. But when we're talking about the new license types, especially, the reason why I'm afraid of that is because if you do that when it comes to delivery, what happens if a cap gets put in? Or what happens if there are no delivery people out there delivering? Then there's going to be other problems like no access to medicine. Also, social equity doesn't work. It's failed. We're going to have the same problems that we've seen in every other state that has tried to limit it only to one group of people. And then the people go ahead.
I didn't see anybody on that list that was having problems fulfilling the licenses because they limited it to only social equity applicants.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And we can talk offline. There's a lot of problems filling the licenses because there's not enough people in the pool.
So thank you. This is a really great conversation, and it sounds like we have some really passionate viewpoints on different ideas of how to create, how to make these differentiations. So what I would really welcome everyone to do is please suss these out in your written comments on the worksheets, because we want to hear pros, cons, long descriptions of the ideas. The more details, the better, so that we can really weigh the pros and cons of the different approaches and see what will fit best. So, but in the purpose of time, we do have some more issues to cover, and I don't want to take up, additional time. So let's move to the next question.
Erica, just before we move to the next question, I think Show Coleman has a last comment, and then we move to the next slide. Is that okay?
Okay, great.
But Erica, I need an explanation on who's going to decide what fits.
So, I mean,
can you guys hear me real quick?
Yes.
Do you mind if I jump in? Sorry. Okay. Sorry. For some reason, I keep getting muted and then I cannot unmute myself. So sorry if I missed the conversation, but I can try to answer your question, Councilwoman. So you're wondering who's going to answer the question on how we distribute, if we do some type of prioritized distribution of licenses to social equity applicants, who makes that decision on what that would look like? Is that your question?
Yes.
Okay. So, well, first of all, we're at this stage right now where we're taking input on that idea and different concepts or proposals for what that might look like. And then we're going to take all the feedback that we've been gathering, the research that we've looked at from other cities, and develop that into a proposal. And what we'd like to do with this group next is maybe take 6 to 8 weeks to flesh that out, actually get words on paper, and to get into some of the details a little bit, and then bring this group back together and present more of an actual proposal after we've taken your ideas and formed it into something, and then get some feedback on that packaged proposal. And then we would take that and move that forward through the rest of the process with, you know, and it would require ordinances, so it would become presented to City Council.
And the public stakeholders too, correct?
Absolutely. Yep. Yeah. Full public stakeholder process. I mean, we'd go back through and have another one of these meetings. In my ideal world, it wouldn't be this virtual setting, because obviously it presents some challenges. And so, yeah, I would hope that we could do some type of in-person form, you know, a feedback session from all of you as well as the public, and then still do even a more robust stakeholder feedback session with the public before we even bring it to City Council. So that would be the plan.
As long as there are options for the public to weigh in on.
Of course. Okay, so I'm gonna, now while I actually have the ability to speak without an echo, and before I get muted again, I'm gonna move forward into the next couple of slides, because there's a bunch of information that I would like to share with all of you before, to kind of close out this conversation. Can everybody see the slide right now on saying how does existing licensing framework affect implementation? Is that the one that's up on the screen? Mm-hmm. Great. Okay. So so we've talked a little bit about this in a bunch of these conversations today, but that's really what these next couple of slides present, is what the existing licensing framework is, and thinking through each of those pieces. How does that affect the implementation of a successful equity program? So I think Sarah mentioned it was when you have an equity program and then you lay the business piece on top of it, some of these logistics or some of these technical details get complicated and can affect the success of an equity program. So there's lots of pieces of information here, so bear with me a little bit. I know a lot of you have this background information, whether you're an existing business owner or have been in the industry a while, or you are a prospective business owner and you've faced these challenges. But they do get a little bit complicated. So the first piece of our existing framework is the caps on storefronts and cultivation locations. So at the beginning of this year, we set those caps at 299 for cultivation, 220 for storefronts, and 451 for cumulative. The location cap basically is that we'll issue licenses for both retail marijuana stores and cultivations. They'll be subject to this cap, and the formula is all based in ordinance. And then now that the cap has set, we will hold a lottery to access those licenses or to issue those licenses. And that lottery, the first one will be held at some point in 2021, and we'll distribute those licenses to eligible locations. And protection is given to the most saturated neighborhoods. So that lottery, there's a bunch of requirements and information about the lottery in ordinance, and this was established in early 2016 through some city council amendments to the marijuana code. And so you can see on the slide here, there's a list of some pre-qualification requirements for the lottery. Things such as proof of prior approval of the state license, proof of financial capability, proof of possession, no previous marijuana licensing violations in the preceding year, that type of thing. And so those are the lottery pre-qualifications. There is a scale back provision. This isn't necessarily, I don't think, something that presents a challenge or a barrier, but just wanted to put that out there that there's this provision for cultivation locations that actually scales back the number that may be able to be issued. And then the final one is an undue concentration provision. And so what this does is it looks at the 5 most concentrated neighborhoods for both cultivation and store licenses and pulls those out of where locations that would be eligible for licenses within the lottery. And so, you know, that just comes into play a little bit further too as we start to look at the locations that are available. And so I'm going to go through all of these slides pretty quickly, and then would love to kind of hear, you can piece them out in your feedback, but just trying to get all the information out there to kind of look at it comprehensively. The next piece, which I know has come up with several times with lots of you, is the zoning requirements. So what we have here on this first one is a map of stores and centers where they're allowed to go based solely on zoning. And so for a retail store, you have to go into a zone district that allows for retail sales. That's the same zone district that you would have to go into if you were selling anything else in Denver, if you had a clothing store or a jewelry store. And so the green areas are allowed zone use districts for for stores and centers. This next slide shows the allowed zone use districts for cultivation. And so everything that's white, a cultivation facility which requires a zone use of plant husbandry, is not allowed to go in that district, in that area. So again, it's limited based on the zone use district and the definition. The other key piece of our licensing framework are proximity requirements. So we've talked about these a little bit with hospitality businesses, but I wanted to put them out again here for you to just be able to see for both stores and centers, designated consumption areas, and cultivation facilities. We have those proximity restrictions that businesses have to comply with when they're looking for a location for where to place their business. Other requirements as a part of the application are compliance with advertising restrictions, having a public hearing for storefronts and designated consumption areas. That's a requirement that you have to have a needs and desires hearing, and the businesses have to establish that there is a need and a desire for that business in that neighborhood. And then finally, designated consumption area licenses also have to have evidence of community support. So they have to get an RNO, a registered neighborhood organization, or some other organization within their community to say they don't oppose that business going there or that they support them going there. And so that's an important requirement as well. And I think this is the final piece of information that I'll have, or no, one more after this. But this is a similar map to before where it had the zoning restrictions on there, but also laid over this is proximity requirements. So all those proximity requirements that were in that previous slide, the kind of yellowish area with the red line around it, those are proximity areas where businesses would not be able to locate there because they would not qualify for within the proximity requirements. So at this point then they're limited to just that plain or the green areas is where they would be allowed to go once where there's no proximity requirements and no zoning restrictions. So that's stores and centers, and this next one is cultivation facilities. So cultivation licenses would be limited to going into those green areas. And then finally, a piece of the application requirements are community engagement plans. We have them required for all types of retail licenses, and then with our most recent license that we created, which is the medical research and development license, we kind of modified a little bit and called them social impact plans. And I bolded on the right there kind of the differences between a community engagement plan and a social impact plan. And so just thinking through these, again, are these something that are an effective tool to achieving equity, not necessarily in licensing, but making sure that the businesses are having equity standards and diversity and inclusion practices, or are they a barrier? Are they something that we need to be considering and altering that we could be doing more effectively? So those are all, that's a whole bunch of information that I know is a lot to take in, but I would love to hear from some of you as far as your experience or your knowledge in these areas and seeing which of these pieces of our framework are creating barriers and would affect the success of an equity program. But then also I think a lot of these are, I think back to what Henny was saying earlier, which is striking that balance and making sure that we're maintaining the key pieces of our framework that protect public health, that protect youth, and ensure that we're, maintaining youth usage rates and not seeing increases, and just all those important public health questions that were asked and were the reason for some of these requirements being put in there in the first place. So want to strike that balance to make sure that we're removing barriers, but not removing anything from the public health and safety requirements. I'll stop talking and I may lose sound again, but just want to hear from you guys now.
Why are there no changes being proposed for zoning requirements? When we look at those maps, we're literally only allowing the impact in the most impacted areas. All of the green is in the inverted L.
So again, we're not, right now we're not proposing any changes. We're looking at what some of these barriers are and are hoping to hear feedback from all of you. And then we'll develop what the proposed changes might be. But also an important piece of that is that as excise and licenses, we have very little control over the zoning code. That is a very city council driven code. And also in coordination with the Community Planning and Development Department. But again, would love to hear your thoughts on that, especially given if the other council members are on the phone at all now too, if that's something that council members will be interested in driving or looking at. Again, that's just not something that's really within our purview.
I think that it's important for CPD to work with excise and licensing if your entire licensing program is predicated on zoning. And looking at this map, discriminatory zoning. So I think we need to bring in CPD to have this conversation so that we can alleviate some of the harm that we've created in how we rolled out the beginning of this.
Okay, we can loop them into the conversation, and would love to have you join us as well, because a lot of the zoning code is council led. So
happy to help.
Truman Bradley.
So I remember when these setbacks were being contemplated by City Council, and I testified against making them as restrictive as they are for reasons that are now obvious in this presentation. I don't think industry is going to fight for grow or retail licenses in the city of Denver because it's so darn hard to find one. And, at this point, it'll be just, getting the scraps of what's left, to be totally candid. I do think that the zoning restrictions on cannabis licenses are a clear barrier. And MIG would support relaxing those. One example is a 1,000-foot buffer zone between cultivations and any residential zone district. I mean, that's darn near a quarter mile. It's just really unnecessary. Same thing with retail. It just rules out so much. And I've mentioned this before in these stakeholder work groups, but when it comes to hospitality licenses, the reason why Ordinance 300 was a failure was because, number one, it's impossible to make money, and number two, it's almost impossible to find a spot on the board to have one of these things. And so I think there are some clear barriers here.
Sarah.
Was there somebody else in the queue, Bia?
Yep,
Sarah
is ready.
Okay. Agree with everything Truman said and with what Councilman Cedabaka said. The other thing that we need to remember is that even though there's the new cultivation and retail coming on board, with the next year's lottery, there's still a lottery and there's still all these strenuous license suitability requirements. And if we know that there's only 10 and we know that they're going to go to all social equity candidates, I think that the lottery requirement should be moved. So that's just basically a low level explanation, but that will be one of our recommendations, is that there's no lottery for the remaining cultivation and retail licenses.
Or that the lottery, I mean, it depends.
Why would, got a question here. why was the lottery procedure proposed, number one? And then in the lottery pre-qualification requirements, 1, 2, 3, 4, number 4, proof of financial capability to open and operate a retail marijuana establishment. If in fact you have a lottery, and how do you make sure that there's a social equity determinant in the lottery if it's a lottery? Because a lottery is supposed to be for anybody, unless the lottery is just going to be for social equity applicants. And then if you have a predeterminate pre-qualification for the lottery that says, but even if you fall within the lottery, if you don't have the financial capability to open and operate, do we kick you out? Are you disqualified? Do you not be allowed to be in the lottery? Who makes those decisions, and how do we get to the lottery in the first place?
So the lottery was established in early 2016. It was something that came out by City Council. City Council. So it was, we were nearing the end of the 2-year transition phase, which was when we were only allowing existing medical licensees to either convert or add a retail license. And instead of extending that transition phase or looking at letting that lapse, City Council initiated this cap and lottery process. And so I forget what the second part of your question was, John.
Well, it was related
about the financial capability requirements. Yeah. And so again, like, I mean, no excuses here, but it was 2016. These conversations just were not up off the ground yet, unfortunately. And so I think this is a great time to kind of, now that we're here looking at this and wondering whether that is a requirement. And I hear the proposal that maybe a lottery isn't required if we're issuing all the licenses available underneath the cap to social equity applicants, is what I'm hearing the proposal or the idea that was thrown out.
Okay, but are we also saying then, because the councilwoman asked a question, who ultimately makes the decision? And so we have said it a couple of times, what we're doing is making recommendations and sharing our best thinking on best practices and an approach to help Denver come up with a social equity plan and program. But theoretically and practically speaking, y'all are going to take all of this and you can send it to not only the 3 city councilmen who are sitting with us here, but the rest of the city councilmen based on the recommendations that have come up out of this meeting. And so if the councilwoman sees something here, then it would behoove her to start preparing her colleagues for the fact that she's raising these questions as an educational piece, because part of the problem is that, like council, like some of us here, we're not all on the same page. And the determinant, or that which will sort of bring us all together, will be a conversation that will allow us all to be thinking about what social equity looks like, means, and what success ultimately in the midst of a culture that is socially equity driven will look like. But I think that if we don't use this as a way to educate ourselves and not use something from 2016 as a guiding focus for 2020, to me is disingenuous.
Molly, aren't these part of the rules and regulations process though? This is not, the lottery requirements don't have to be changed by ordinance, do they?
All those requirements that are listed on this slide here are in ordinance, yes. We have ability to set rules for and regs for the lottery process, but what's listed here is in ordinance.
Then do we have the ability to make a recommendation that, which is Sarah's point, that the recommendation that the lottery be removed and that some of the lottery pre-qualifications, if the lottery is removed, then the pre-qualifications either become moot or need to be laid out and reframed?
Or could you or could you just add an exception for a social equity applicant, which changes everything? Because say you get no social equity applicants, you would want these lottery pre-qualification requirements to still apply to the non-social equity applicants. So just adding in, you know, an asterisk unless you are a social equity applicant, and then see other rules regarding social equity applicants.
Question out of the clear blue. Question out of the clear blue sky, Molly. Just question out of the clear blue sky, right here. What are the number? What are the number of revoked licenses, say in the last 2 years?
I don't have that number off the top of my head, but we can send that out. We can get that.
Okay, no, okay, one. And okay, so that's one. And then two, are the licenses reviewed annually, every 2 years, every 3 years?
For the lottery?
Yeah, well, no, just in terms of
applications annually, John. Every year they have to renew.
All right,
Can you hear me? Wait, John, this is Ashley. Every single license, and it has to be a location under lottery, that's been revoked is now sitting there, and that's what is going to be distributed next year. That is that number that Molly said that we've got to play with, whether it's through a lottery, whether it's through an amended lottery, whether it's through, you know, just a pure equity program. That's part of what we're all talking about today. So anything revoked is now in that mix to be redistributed to equity applicants.
All right, that's what I
or surrendered. Yeah.
Okay, that's what I need. Thank you.
And Jessica Scardina is on queue. Jessica.
Who was? Sorry. Oh, Jessica. Okay.
Hi, yeah, Jessica Scardina with Vicente Cedarburg. I just wanted to make a quick point with respect to the pre-qualification requirement of proof of financial capability. So if one of the proposals is to remove that, I would just suggest coordinating with the Marijuana Enforcement Division's licensing division to make sure that they're not also going to require proof of financial capability, because historically they have asked applicants for bank statement copies, loan copies, whatever documentation the applicant can provide to show that they have funds to start the business and run it until they start to make a profit. So I think it's just important to coordinate with them.
Yep, I think that's a good point. I mean, the dual license is a requirement, right? So they'll stay with, you know, all state requirements would still have to be there. But then I think that also comes back to the accelerator options at the state too. So,
okay.
So one more kind of thought about zoning too that you mentioned, and just if anybody has any thoughts or ideas or suggestions. I mean, I think coordinating with CPD, who manage the zoning code that's set by council, is really important. But just to clarify, so retail sales is the zone use that's required for a retail marijuana store. Plant husbandry is the land use that's designated for cultivation. And so I guess I'm just curious what a proposal might be of how a fix could be proposed there, as far as how we would expand the districts in which those types of businesses would be able to locate.
Why wouldn't we do it in any, so when I think about why we relegated cultivations to industrial areas, I'm confused as to why it wasn't open to any commercial area. You know, if you have a Walmart shut down or a Safeway shut down, what makes that structure different than, you know, a tiny little warehouse over here in my neighborhood?
So, hey, Councilwoman, this is Ashley. So just also so everybody's clear, that doesn't just apply to marijuana grows. That applies to a nursery who's growing whatever they're growing, or somebody growing plant tomatoes or anything. These are the general zoning code situations. So it applies to dress shops, not just marijuana stores, and it applies to a bookstore as well. So, you know, just
why didn't you guys consider commercial areas, commercial zoning?
Because that's how when zoning first looked at it, they said, you know, zoning's all about putting like uses like uses. And so cultivation fell more, according to them, to horticultural uses, which is more similar to a plant nursery or growing tomatoes.
So would you guys be willing to, now that you know that it doesn't really need to be in a special area, would you guys be willing to make a recommendation to CPD that it could go into commercial spaces?
Well, and we can definitely continue to have these conversations, but excise and license, we are not the experts on zoning or the zoning code at all. Councilwoman Cedarbaka, you have significantly more influence and knowledge on the zoning code than we at excise and license do. So we can continue this conversation and loop in CPD, but it's not something that's only limited to marijuana. It's every single zone use in the city. This is just slotted into what they think is the right zone use category.
So considering what you just said, would you support me in a recommendation to CPD that we allow cultivation in commercial areas?
Well, we'll have to talk with our team about it, but we've talked about this in the past, but we're happy to continue that conversation.
Is there a reason that it wouldn't fit, in your opinion, now knowing how cultivations work?
Let me interject, Clarissa with National Cannabis Industry Association, Councilwoman, and Ashley, I'm not an expert here, but my sense is that there are also issues with odor control. So there's also a reason why this is also a big problem just all around, issues with odor control in areas where people may not want to smell the cultivation of marijuana.
Well, that's actually the problem, is that there are issues and they've been concentrated in Black and brown communities where our opinions about the issues are not valid. And so if we have a citywide industry, why are we not sharing the burden of it equitably?
Truman is next.
Clarissa really hit it what I was going to talk about, which was there was a pretty epic discussion about odor as it pertained to cannabis here in the city of Denver, and there was an odor ordinance that went into effect, and so I think that's why. And I understand, Councilwoman, about distributing that, etc. It seems like there have not been as many odor complaints as there were before, and I'm not sure exactly if that's because the odor ordinance did its job or people just got sick of complaining. I wouldn't know.
No, it's not because of that. It's because there's no way to enforce an odor ordinance. I live across the street from 4 cultivation facilities, and when I have an odor issue, I have no way to attribute it to one or the other. We have more than 200 cultivation facilities in a 15 square mile radius. And none of them are required to be marked. So when I call into 311 to report an odor issue, they ask you for an address of where it's coming from. And so there's no way for me to pinpoint where it's coming from. And so it's not an effective policy. And our neighborhood was unable to address the odor issue, so has stopped calling in to report it. But part of the odor issue is that we've concentrated it all.
So we hear your proposal, Councilwoman, and can talk with CPD about that. But again, would like Ashley said, I think your influence over the zoning code is higher than ours or stronger than ours. So. But yes, we hear your proposal and can explore those avenues as well. Anything else on these topics quickly before we talked about this a little bit earlier on. John, I think, had some good ideas that I would like to go into a little bit more. But the next question, we kind of finished with this last time, but the final question that I would really like to hear from you all on is, we are in a different economic situation now as a result of COVID. And so we'll be needing to explore innovative ideas for how to fund a social equity program in Denver. There are certain things that don't require funding, like licensing prioritization or allocating licenses to social equity applicants on a 1-for-1 or a priority basis. But things like financial assistance, low interest loans, even workforce development, those things do cost money. And so would love to hear from you any innovative ideas that you all have for looking at revenue sources for this type of thing. I know, Councilwoman, you suggested or mentioned a dedicated revenue source. Do you have an idea of where that revenue could come from? And what would be your ideas or anybody's ideas for looking at something like that?
I think it should come from the current licensees.
In what way? Sorry, in their license fees, in their sales tax, like what from the current licensees?
I mean, I think the thing that's in our closest, the thing we could change the quickest is a fee, so that you don't have to go through the voter process for a tax. So why not allocate a portion of their annual fee?
Okay, so just a reminder too that so the licensing fees currently go into the general fund, and as you know, the general fund is allocated through the annual budget process and is facing a $226 million gap. So, you know, we'd have to look at adding additional license fees in order to supplement or not supplant the dollars that are currently being used in the general fund.
Or just designate the fees.
Due to fiscal policy, our licensing fees, and Molly, isn't this correct, can only charge enough to recoup the cost it costs us to manage it.
Right, yeah.
Probably could not be a licensing fee.
Right, so it wouldn't be able to be a licensing fee, but if you're proposing some other type of fee.
Well, if you add into your costs an equity program, then that is a part of your cost of doing business. And so your fee changes accordingly.
So but I'm sorry, it's what it costs us to administer it as a city. So our time and effort and labor is what I believe, but we could take a look at that fiscal policy to see if there's a way to interpret that more creatively.
Mm-hmm. And right now, you know, licensing fees are anywhere between $2,500 and $5,000. For the existing licenses, we haven't obviously set any fees for the new license types.
What about a sale of any business? Why could we add a fee to a sale of a business, of a license?
I'm not aware of any other fees that we have for other businesses that sell their license, but that's something we could talk to the Department of Finance about if that's a proposal that you'd like us to look into.
Absolutely.
Any other ideas or any thoughts from people within the industry or within the business or general smart finance people?
You know, I've shared my concerns about this. I mean, we need to develop a fund. The industry needs to do more. I'd like to see a Cannabis Control Commission in to help deal with these ongoing issues, because I'm firmly a believer that we are just starting to evolve. Even though we're 8 years and $8 billion, with the social equity component involved, this is a whole new landscape with the pandemic involved, with the racial pandemic involved, with the recession swirling around us. All this is, you know, we're getting ready to go into landscapes that are untreaded, you know, a road less traveled. And so to me, to be able to help move this forward is a recognition that, yeah, we got to go to mayor and council. But ultimately, after we go to mayor and council, there needs to be somebody who's making sure that everything that we're talking about doing here is in fact done. Let me tell you, I love excise and license. They're the best. But unless you go give them more money to bring in more staff, then somebody else is going to have to do not only the cannabis work, but in fact hold the industry, the community, and the city accountable for the social equity evolution and whatever success we get out of that.
Truman and then Sarah.
All right, I guess I'll start with the positive first. One suggestion for excise and license is to consider 2-year renewals and, reduce some of the, administrative time and effort that's spent on these. By and large, most of the industry, most of those renewals are relatively straightforward at this point. So maybe there's some savings there, especially if you collect the money up front. It certainly would reduce the burden on some of the licensees because they just have to fill out less paperwork and all of that. So that's one small suggestion. I think here's the last thing I'll say about where the money is going to come from for this. I think that the way a government spends money, well, really the way anyone spends money is a statement of values. It's what they value, it's what they prioritize. If I spend my money on a nice car, that's what I value, instead of a home or something like that. And so if the city wants to, claim to want to right or wrong, the way that the city spends money is a statement of whether it values Black and brown people. That's just how it is. And I understand that COVID is a challenge, but life has to go on and priorities have to be made. So I will say that the cannabis industry pays some of the highest fees of any in the city when it comes to licensing. And in the same way that folks on this call have wanted to make sure that social equity applicants are set up for success, I worry about killing the, golden goose or the green goose here. If you keep squeezing the industry, there's just not going to be anything left. And it's easy to talk about the top line revenues because that's sexy and that gets headlines. But what matters in business is the bottom line. And the bottom line is a lot less sexy, a lot less pretty than the top line. And anybody in the industry knows that's true. So I'm going to leave it at that. But, there's only so much this industry can take. And I'm grateful we were declared essential. I think it's pretty obvious why. But that's not a reason to squeeze all the blood out.
So I guess along those lines, let me pose one last question. In talking about established businesses, I hear what you're saying, Truman. And so, from the city, we want to live those values around equity, and we want to be able to, see this program executed and successful. But from the established business side, is there anything that you all suggest that the established businesses can do to support and those equity applicants and help them be successful? Are there any incentives that could be considered to make it worthwhile for those established businesses to participate in an equity program? I know that you have the same value that we do, Truman, and other people in this call. And so what else can the industry be doing to help support that same effort along and support those same values?
And Truman, before you respond, we have Sarah and Dan Pabon on queue, Molly, in 3 minutes.
Okay. Go ahead, Sarah and Dan. Sarah first. Oh, you're on mute, Sarah.
Okay. All right. Just to piggyback off what Truman said really quick, everyone has to be held accountable. Everyone has to do their part. We know that ACLU released a report. In the report, Black people specifically are still being arrested in Denver at triple the rate of their white counterparts. We know that there's a huge criminal justice budget that Denver has. Yes, there's COVID, but if this is a priority, then there needs to be funding from the city that can come directly from, the criminal justice budget to help to repair and restore people that have been negatively impacted by the war on drugs. That's my comment.
And Dan?
Yeah, can you guys hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I know we're running out of time. I've been thoughtfully, listening and over the last couple of conversations, just because I wanted to give folks an opportunity to really weigh in. And, what I think a couple of things that I take away from this is some of these things can be solved by partnerships with the city, but some of these things can be solved in partnership with the industry and some of the groups that, you know, either can be facilitated by the city or aren't needed to be facilitated, because the private industry can work with social equity applicants. So I think in addition to, you know, what you said about maybe us coming back in 5 weeks or 6 weeks or whatever that may be, I think it's incumbent upon all of us to maybe have some offline conversations with each other, see what opportunities exist to work with each other, see what the needs are, and try to find that balance between, you know, the public-private partnerships and then the just nonprofit or just private partnerships. So, you know, I think if the city has homework, I think that's homework that we should have as well. And so I just want to volunteer to say I'm happy to be part of that, and anything we can do to come back with how we do this, you know, in partnership would be great.
I think that's a great closing thought. What I'll put up here quickly, just kind of what our next steps are as far as homework. So first of all, you know, please provide us your written comments. I know we didn't hear from a lot of you today. And so if you have additional thoughts, we love real tangible solutions, ideas, and proposals that we can kind of, you know, sink our hands in a little bit. That's what we're going to be doing over the next couple of weeks, is really putting pen to paper and doing the hard part, which is the drafting and making sure all of this makes sense. And you know, the devil's in the details, and so we know you need to see some of those details in order to be able to respond and react, and that's what we want to be working on over the next couple of weeks. But would love your thoughts and input on what those details might be. And so what we're proposing is that we take some time to digest all the feedback from you that we've heard today, and that hopefully we receive an additional written comment from you all, both you on the work group and the members of the public. And we'll continue to have conversations too with all of you individually, or, you know, with our city partners or other stakeholders as well. So once we have done that piece and figured out what those details might look like, we'd like to share that with all of you, and again, hear your responses and reactions to all of that before we move it forward into a proposal that goes through the rest of the public process and the city council process. So I guess we'll leave it at that, and I apologize for all of the technical difficulties today on my end, but I appreciate all of your help. You guys are inspirational and thoughtful, and I really appreciate everything you guys have shared with us, and look forward to continuing our partnership. Ashley, you want to add anything?
No, thank you. And thanks again, everybody, for the conversation.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.